Hello, and welcome to another episode of Branchspace Future Picks podcast, where we pick up on and break down the latest ideas, technologies, and commercial strategies shaping the future of aviation travel and retailing. I'm your host, Clarissa Jenkins. Today, we're tackling one of the most talked about and often misunderstood topics in airline commercial: dynamic pricing. Because dynamic pricing isn't just about changing fares more frequently. No, it also affects how airlines can see retailing and their subsequent product offerings, whether it's addressed as ancillaries, bundles, loyalty tiers, segmentation, contextualization, and the wider tech stack that's orchestrating all of this and more across each digital channel. I'm joined by fellow branchies, Radu Iliescu, Managing Director of Transform Consulting, and Niels Colemont, an airline revenue management consultant and pricing expert. Together, we unpack why pricing is no longer a fixed model, but actually a spectrum from continuous to atomic models, and how, despite the industry buzz, most airlines are still in the early stages of that journey. We also examined the operational reality behind it all, what airlines really need to rethink across offer management, distribution, product strategy, and data to make dynamic retailing actually work at scale. And naturally, we talk AI, not just the hype, but where it can generate real commercial value and optimize pricing and offers. Also, where airlines need to be far more deliberate in how they apply AI. So, whether you work in e commerce, revenue management, distribution, or commercial strategy, this episode offers a practical look at how airlines can finally put their prices where their proposition is. Are you ready? And without further ado, please give a warm welcome and help me in welcoming to the Branchspace Future Picks podcast, Radu and Niels. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me today. How are we feeling? How are we doing today?
Brilliant. Thanks, Clarissa, for having us.
And
Yep,
Niels, how
thank
are
you.
you feeling today?
Great. Thank you. Looking forward.
Fabulous. Good. Yeah. Well, if it's all good with you guys, I'd love to just jump right in. We've got a lot to cover, and I want to get as many of your insights as possible. So, per usual, would love to hear some introductions from both of you. Radu, especially before we get into the substance, I know our listeners would be really interested in hearing a bit about you, your background, and the fact that it spans across banking, e-commerce, and airline technology before you arrived at Branchspace and in the consulting space. So can you tell us a bit about that journey and how you ended up at Branchspace?
Sure. So, well, maybe starting in reverse chronological order. For the past 10 years, I was with Branchspace. I am the managing director of Branchspace Consulting. So I lead our consulting work together with two of my colleagues. And for those of you who don't know Branchspace, we are a highly specialized boutique consultancy who focus exclusively on airline digital retail and distribution technology. We work with some of the largest airlines, certainly in Europe. All the largest airlines in Europe are or have been at some point our customers, primarily in the modern airline retailing space. Prior to Branchspace, I spent 6 years working for an airline, for several airlines. In fact, I worked for Lufthansa Group. I started in Brussels Airlines, then I moved to Lufthansa Group, where in both cases, I worked in digital, in the e-commerce space. Prior to that, I spent a few years in retail banking, again in e-commerce, or at least what passes for e-commerce in retail banking, not quite the same thing as for airlines. And yeah, so my entire career was basically in the digital and e-commerce space. And for the last 16 actually, gosh, 16 years, it was in the airline space.
That's it's really interesting to hear that, especially the fact that you've had, like you said, even though you've been in different industries, kind of the niche within those industries is the e-commerce or the retail aspect. Quick follow-up question: was there any particular reason for that? Do you feel yourself drawn towards retail and e-commerce versus another department?
Yeah. Good question. I think for my personality, this fits really well for two reasons. Firstly, it does, and that's particularly true in the airline space. There is a huge amount of problem solving, so you have to get really creative, and that appeals to me. It's what I love to do. The fact that airlines have to use really complex technological workarounds, which we will come back to later in this podcast, to circumvent the limitations of legacy technology, that gives an incredibly fertile ground for technological problem solving. So I love that. The other element which I love in this space is it's just the instant gratification. The instant gratification afforded by having full control of the e-commerce, the selling pipeline, and the fact that for airlines that conversion happens in one end-to-end flow. You have full control of the whole thing. Definitely more so than with banking, because in many cases in banking you don't actually have full control of the whole flow. In some cases you only control let's say the lead generation, but not the actual conversion. And with physical goods retailing, you don't often have control. As being in charge of the e-commerce channel, you often don't have the control over the fulfillment, the delivery. While with airlines, you have mostly control over the end-to-end cycle, apart of course from the actual physical experience of flying. But for the rest, you do have the control and visibility over the end-to-end flow.
And not to mention a lot of opportunity for growth and innovation within this industry.
Oh, those don't matter.
And Niels, I haven't forgotten about you, I promise. Would love to hear the same kind of intro from you as well. You've also had quite a journey, including building and scaling your own startup within the airline space. So can you tell us a bit more about your background and, what has led you to being here today?
Well, I think most of my background is in airline IT, specifically pricing revenue management. Early in my career, worked for several airlines. In fact, where I met Radu at Brussels Airlines, we were there both simultaneously. At some point, we saw an opportunity to build an ancillary revenue management solution, which wasn't in the market at that time. And we decided with a group of friends actually to build it ourselves. And this is how I got into the building and into the vendor sphere within the airline industry. And luckily, our company was bought by Flyer, so at Flyer we could scale the software and distribute it to bigger airlines. And then as Flyer pitched to offer an order management, I also transitioned more into the wider scope of systems or commercial systems in aviation, specifically the innovation or the drive to innovate those systems, specifically to the offer optimization, offer management, but still very much in revenue management and pricing. And recently I joined Wiremind, which is building a state-of-the-art revenue management system, which is one of these companies that also drives the innovation in the industry. And I think that's, in summary, my entire career, I've always tried to question the status quo and question where things could go better, what could go better for the airlines using the systems.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure it's like a mixture of the airlines, but also how that affects passengers and their various, internal departments and goals. But the kind of way that you have the journey that you've taken and the way that it's come about is very, very interesting. You're still working with and collaborating with a few other vendors or companies while having your startup. So I'm sure you're very busy all the time. And so thank you so much for your intros. Now let's get to the meat of everything, particularly around the pricing frontier. So what's going on right now with pricing? And so Radu, earlier this year, we actually published an article that was based on a talk that you had given on dynamic pricing. And it was been one of the most read pieces. And I think that really tells you something about where the industry's head is at right now and what they're thinking about. For listeners who maybe haven't come across it, the central argument is that dynamic pricing is not one thing, but an entire spectrum, essentially, ranging from continuous pricing all the way through to something called atomic pricing. So again, we have the continuous and then atomic. And that most airlines are much earlier stages than the conversation around them would suggest. So talking about it is one thing, but implementing it and executing it is another. With that being said, could you walk us through that framework, what it means to give us, your honest read on where most of the airlines actually stand today?
Firstly, it's really gratifying that we had such a high level of interest in this topic, and which gives me now the opportunity to bore even more people with this. Um, well, actually, now that we can get into a deeper level of detail, it's worth saying that yes, it's a spectrum, but it's not even one unidimensional, monodimensional spectrum. It is, depending on how you look at it, it's either a combination of multiple spectra, at least 4 that I can think of off the top of my head, or one multidimensional spectrum. Well, in this case, it would be a 4-dimensional one. And then we can go into a lot more detail on that, but just for now, it's worth saying that the 4 most important dimensions that I can think of are the granularity of the product at which you define the pricing. And that ties into what you were saying earlier, Clarissa, about atomic pricing. Atomic pricing is, in a way, the holy grail of one of the holy grails of the transition to offer management. And the idea there is not to price a bundle of multiple services or multiple products or elements together, which is what the vast majority of airlines do today when they file a fare, because a fare is not tied to one specific services. It is always tied to a combination of several services, what we would call in the new terminology of offer and order a bundle. So instead of pricing a bundle as a whole, the idea of atomic pricing is to individually price every single element of the bundle, then calculate the total bundle price together as the sum of those elements, and then apply an additional level of price optimization at the bundle level as well. So atomic pricing, just to be clear, doesn't exclude the notion of optimizing the price at a bundle level as well, but it gives you a much more informed starting point for optimizing the price of the bundle by calculating the optimal price of each individual element within a bundle.
So if I could interrupt you for a second. So from a user standpoint or passenger standpoint, if I was looking for flights for a trip 1 week and I get all the way to the point of payment and I decide to abandon my cart, and within that cart, there's a bundle. If I were to go back to that exact same airline website 2 weeks later and select the exact same bundle, is there a chance that the price would actually end up being different because if they're using atomic pricing?
Clarissa, it's not a matter of 2 weeks, it's a matter of 2 seconds.
It's 2 seconds.
I mean, people experience a lot this today with the so-called surge pricing of taxi hailing apps. On Uber, it's a common experience. If you do the same search a few seconds apart, or 2 people do the same search standing one next to another at the same time, they will get usually a minute price difference, but there you can absolutely get a price difference. And that's going to be the case in the future, very likely with airlines as well, because the more sophisticated the pricing algorithms become and the more signals we take in within that price modeling, the greater the chance that, the greater the fluidity of the pricing generally. So the price will be a lot more fluid than it is today. Even today, to be honest, it is fluid. I mean, even today, you probably don't, with fairly static pricing driven by ATPCO filing and booking class based availability, you probably don't need to wait for 2 weeks to get a price difference. It's quite common to get a price difference within minutes or days. In the future, it will probably be a matter of seconds. And this actually comes with its own challenges and constraints because, for example, caching, dynamic pricing becomes a much bigger challenge than it is today.
That's very interesting. I hadn't thought about that, the caching. And thank you so much for that useful map of the outline of where pricing is heading.
We've talked so far about one of the 4 dimensions of the pricing spectrum, which is the granularity. The second one is just the level of sophistication of the pricing algorithm itself. And I would see here about 4 different levels, starting with what I call table pricing. By the way, that's not official terminology in any sense. It's just what I call purely static pricing, where you define for a given route or set of travel dates or sales dates, this is the price. That's it. Then you have rule-based pricing, which is quite common in the airline merchandising world for ancillary products like seats or bags, where there is a baseline reference price, which is often filed again in ATPCO, but then you use rules to modify that price upwards or downwards based on certain conditions. For example, if your baseline reference price for a seat for a given route is 20 euros, if the seat is a window or aisle seat, you increase that by 10 euros. If it is a middle seat, you might decrease it by 5 euros. If it's front of the cabin, you increase it. This is actually what used to be called this kind of rule-based type of price adjustment. This is what used to be called dynamic pricing up until a few years ago when true dynamic pricing came about. And so that would be for me the second level of sophistication. The third level is pricing based on a statistical model, typically based on forecasting. And this is what airlines have traditionally been using in revenue management for flights or for right to fly. And then there is I would say the fourth level, which is based on, and to be fair, there isn't a super clear delineation between these two. It's more of a spectrum again, a gradient from forecasting model based to more AI or machine learning based pricing. But there is a difference, right? So typically, a forecasting model will give you a bid price curve as an output. More sophisticated model will take into account willingness to pay, and it can be based on just different types of mathematical models. For example, there are vendors who are using models similar to large language models for price optimization today, which is a fairly recent development. So that's the second part. Then the third dimension is the degree to which the price optimization process happens on the fly or in real time, as opposed to happening offline or non-real time or as a batch process or as a scheduled job. For example, in dynamic pricing, it is quite common. Actually, I would say it's pretty much standard for the bid price to be calculated out of a forecasting model which is not executed in real time. That's executed offline or in the background with various degrees of frequency. I would say best practice now is to reoptimize the bid price curve maybe once every 2 minutes, but most airlines will not do that. Most airlines will use once a day reoptimization or once every several hours reoptimization. However, other types of models like a willingness to pay model can be executed in real time, and these I would argue is best executed in real time. And then the fourth dimension that I wanted to mention is the degree of contextualization or personalization. Just to be clear, when we talk about price, I'm quite cautious to talk about personalization because that can lead people into thinking that we are discriminating pricing at an individual level, which is not okay. It's generally considered illegal. Therefore, we prefer to refer to contextualization. So yeah, it's contextualization based on the search parameters that a specific customer is using, but it can also include signals which are customer specific to a certain extent. For example, loyalty tier can be an element here, and it can include signals which are real time but have nothing to do with either the search or the customer. And a good example here, well, competitions pricing is a good such example, but another example could be weather. Weather is actually a powerful predictor and influencer of conversion. Therefore, I would argue it makes sense to be a signal into a pricing model as well.
So that could be like an element of willingness to pay, like the weather it could be a variable within that willingness to, okay.
Yeah. The
Very
worse the weather
interesting.
outside, the higher the willingness to pay tends to be.
Yeah, exactly. I never thought about that, how much of an effect weather could play on it. And there's just so much there. We'll definitely want to maybe even build up a chart to really outline it for everyone and have that useful map really visual. But it does really indicate where pricing is heading. So I thank you so much for that. But even when an airline does get the pricing right, whether they're using, to your point, real time versus predetermined or contextualization, there's a whole other challenge that comes into play on the product side. And so, Niels, back to you. In your experience, what is the real gap between how airlines think about their products today and what the product logic actually needs to look like for dynamic pricing to work properly, not only today, but in the future as, say, AI develops more and more, or the variables for willingness to pay get changed or added as well?
Yeah, well, the relationship between product or product determination and price determination is actually very dependent on the type of product we're talking about. We can talk about flights, but we can also talk about ancillaries or third-party products. And today, very often, if you talk about real dynamic pricing and dynamic product determination, airlines are restricted on how to do this because of the systems they're using internally in order to determine price and product. So, for example, if we talk about the flight, the right to fly, the core business of an airline, for most full service carriers, here price and products are connected to each other. They have to, because of the state of their passenger service systems or PSS, they will have to file a price and a product in ATP code. So you will have a fare basis code, which is the name of your product. You will have a price attached to it, and you will have a whole set of rules and conditions connected to this, which determines the eligibility and the restrictions of that so-called product. Now, again, the reasons why airlines do this is because the PSS needs it, but also for example, to have a unified taxonomy to work together with other airlines. For ancillaries and other products, it really depends on what systems the airlines are individually using to define new products, and how to price them. So also there, what you very often see is that if an airline wants to add a new ancillary or a new bundle, it will take them months from initiation to actually being available on their channels. Now, we didn't even talk about the granularity of the pricing. Very often, to do granular pricing of ancillaries, you also have to go through hoops and through workarounds to be able to achieve this, because you still have to integrate it back into these what they call legacy processes and systems. So it's not that easy today for an airline to be fully flexible in product determination.
And if I can quickly add to that, there is an additional challenge here coming from the distribution channels themselves as well. Leaving aside the GDS, which is infamously inflexible and rigid in terms of what you can distribute and limited in terms of what you can distribute as a product through it. Even on the so-called digital channels or online channels like your digital direct, like airline.com or NDC, there are constraints which, well, they may not be inherently necessary, but they are a reality for many airlines, probably the majority of airlines, because historically the product definition has been so static. Many airlines have implemented digital channel solution architectures which are what I would call lazy. They rely on hard coding, for example, of the contents of a fare brand. They don't display the so-called amenities or the services within a fare brand dynamically. And that means that each time you are adding a new product, whether it's a new bundle or brand, a fare brand, or a new ancillary, there is also sometimes quite significant development work that has to be done at the level of the distribution channel, and that makes it even more complicated. It's also fair to say that these limitations, which are distribution channel related, will not necessarily be eliminated by the transition to modern airline retailing, because they exist in a completely different level of the technology stack, and you can very well choose to implement a new best-in-class offer and order management system underneath. If your digital channel is still poorly architected, you are still going to face constraints. But our expectation is that with the transition to modern airline retailing, the ability to technically configure and test products at a much, much greater velocity than today, and with more airlines adopting modern product in testing and innovation cycle, that will also actually gradually, it will force the distribution channels to implement better architectures, rely more on dynamic information coming from the offer to display products correctly. And our vision, aspiration, hope for the future is that a fair brand could be configured, activated on a distribution channel, and tested with, well, not at least started to be tested within a few hours, maybe a few days at most, but not a few months or sometimes a few years like it is the case today.
So you kind of need, it's a trying to find the balance between being able to implement, roll out, test something quickly, not relying on the vendor interference or the back and forth chasing emails, but also is it flexible? Can we make changes to it? Can we bundle it? Can we use contextualizations to target certain, and how does that all play out on the different channels? Like, it's not just website, we have mobile apps and even multiple mobile apps, such as what we did with KM Malta, helping them recently with their loyalty mobile app. So can you make that all concise, all of that synchronized or independent strategically from one another, all at the same time with one ancillary? It could just be for one ancillary.
Absolutely.
That's a lot to juggle. I can imagine. That can be tough.
Yeah.
And if I, sorry, just one more thing here. Yes, absolutely. That's the goal. That's our vision. And an important element in this, Clarissa, is we want to instill a new way of working, to facilitate a new way of working within airlines, which doesn't rely anymore on intuition or belief. We believe that product selection and product pricing should not be driven by faith or intuition. It should be driven by scientific testing. Therefore, like the range of fair brands or bundles that you are displaying to a customer and the price points, what we think is the optimal price point at which we are proposing those products, that should not be based on what a human believes is, based on their experience, is the best option. It should rather be based on trialing, scientifically testing the product, and then keeping what works well and eliminating what doesn't work well. It's a very different way of working, because even in today's world, I mean, airlines in a way literally have written the book on revenue management. What the revenue management that is used today in a lot of industries, including in ride hailing, is based on forecasting models and algorithms that airlines have been playing with for the last 60 years. But if you go into the actual revenue management departments of many airlines, including really, really large airlines and some of the most technologically ambitious and sophisticated airlines, you will still find that a lot of very crucial decisions are based on people's instinct or belief. And of course, it's an educated instinct. It's not, these are people who have spent their entire careers in revenue management. But it doesn't mean that their beliefs are always inherently right.
Would you agree with that, Niels? I mean, as the kind of expert here on rev management, bringing it home.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's true that the aviation has always been at the forefront of the revenue management practices, but still there can be a lot of improvements. And one of the reasons is also that systems or processes are not really communicative to each other, which then results in, how you say, suboptimal outcomes. But as Radu mentioned, so one of the big reasons why airlines are transitioning to modern airline retailing, or in a more systems way to order-centric systems, a replacement of the PSS to order management system and everything what's around it, is because they want to have full flexibility in what they offer to who they offer it and when they offer it. And one of the cornerstones there is that, as I mentioned today, specifically for the flight, price and product termination are together, that tomorrow these will be completely split. You have a product determination session, and then based on that information, a price is added. So in simple terms, you do a shop on a website for an airline who already transitioned to modern airline retailing order management system. You do a shop, your origin and destination, your date. The offer management system will first determine which products I want to offer to that specific traveler. And then it will determine, do I have availability or do I have enough stock to offer this? And what are my stock levels? And based on this information, it will call a pricing engine, which will determine the price of these specific products, which we want to offer. And that the key is this pricing engine, which is then connected to multiple revenue management dynamic pricing optimization engines for its specific products, which can put it in one price, without any limitation of a legacy process or process which airlines have to follow today. So this will be a huge change for airlines, but it also proves that revenue management going tomorrow will be even more significant than it is today, because you might have multiple revenue management systems operating at such a granularity. Will make it revenue management teams will be very popular in the next 10 years in most airlines.
I mean, that's interesting to hear. I guess I need to start buddying up to the rev management teams more as they become more, so important, more vital. I am curious, when you were talking about the multiple systems that could have multiple systems, is it airlines could have multiple systems within themselves and then also their partners, their ancillary, third party partners have their own systems? Or is it the fact that airlines have their own system and any time that they work with a partner or a third party ancillary, that is where the additional systems come into play?
It's a combination of both. Per
Okay.
default, you will have your flight optimization, your traditional revenue management, the core of the business. But you also have ancillaries. You might want to do dynamic
Mhm.
pricing of bags, dynamic pricing of seats. And although I expect vendors to offer this in one solution, what we call total revenue management, a solution which can track the total revenue which is expected on a flight, airlines might opt for best of breed, different systems together. So this would be internal. Of course, there's also partnerships. First off, the partners, the airline partners, which an airline might have, and with the transition to order management, we will actually just, when we want to add a partner airline, we will just call the offer management system of the partner, who will return us also a continuous price. And then for third-party products, well, that's a bit of a question mark. It really also depends. We talk hotels and car rental. What systems and what are they working on, and what functionality do these systems have? They might not follow the airline industry that fast, and we might need to upload fixed prices for some of the third parties. So it can be a combination of everything. The key is that an offer management system can bring it all together, and like Radu said, when a shock comes, optimize it as a whole to increase the conversion rate, increase the revenue, and to actually just serve the traveler the best way. I think that's in a nutshell.
Okay, that was a lot of fascinating information. There's a lot of moving parts going on, not only with, internally with the airlines, but their partners, the vendors, the passengers, the markets, and the channels. There's just so many factors at play here. And that's just the offer aspect, putting together those offers, putting together those pricings. And Radu, one of the topics that I was really hoping to dig into today is what you actually call the sell decision, the connection between how airlines approach overbooking and the never stop selling principle. So how does rethinking that connect to dynamic pricing exactly? What happens if you get it wrong? How does that create such intense problems downstream for the airline and its passengers?
Well, so firstly, Clarissa, it's worth saying that what we call the sell decision or offerability decision, is not necessarily linked to the notion of never stopping selling or infinite overbooking. There is a correlation, definitely. The transition to the new way of looking at the sell decision is an enabler for the latter, but it doesn't mean that you are obliged to do it in the future. What we call the sell decision is effectively the future way of determining the availability of the product. In today's world, availability tends to be a binary decision. Yes, it is available, or no, it is not available, or a numerical decision determining how many items I am still willing to sell of this product, which is the typical way of looking at the availability of the right to fly, which is the booking class based or RBD based availability. With the transition to dynamic selling decisions, well, firstly, obviously, booking classes are meant to disappear. We don't see a need for RBDs anymore. And the decision is changing a bit from a binary yes or no decision, yes, I'm going to sell, or no, I'm not going to sell, to a decision of at what price I am still willing to sell. Meaning that, so I'll take a concrete example. I know it sounds a bit abstract. Imagine that you have a flight with a capacity.
No, I think I remember this. This is classic, Econ 102, 104. So yeah, please continue. It's great to hear.
So a simple example is, imagine you have an aircraft with a capacity of 100 seats. Intuitively, you would say, I have 100 seats to sell. realistically, airlines will sell more than 100 seats on most routes. There is, even in the legacy world, there is a notion of overbooking. You would typically establish, based on historical data, how many more seats you can sell on a flight, or you should sell on a flight, in order to maximize its seat load factor. Because if you sell 100 seats, a certain percentage of the passengers on that flight are going to cancel or change their flight, or there will just be no shows on that flight. So if you just sell exactly 100, well, you are very secure from a passenger's experience point of view, because you are not risking having a problem with more passengers coming to the flight than you actually have space for, but you are very likely going to fly with a number of empty seats. So airlines, historically, what they do, and it's not only airlines, I believe it's most travel providers or providers of services which are inherently constrained in terms of capacity, they will, again, use historical data to determine that typically it is done at a route level. For London to JFK, for example, we know that we need to sell about 20% more seats than physically available in order to maximize our seat load factor. And that gets configured in the PSS inventory. And once you have sold the physical capacity plus this overbooking percentage, then you stop. The new way of looking at it, and that's what I think you are referring to with the never stopping selling principle. One possible approach here is that even if you have sold out your physical capacity and the overbooking buffer, so you can now statistically expect that any additional seat sold will lead to a passenger being displaced, because you are simply selling more than you have physically available, and even taking into account people who will be canceling or changing or be no-shows, you are still willing to sell if the price is right. So imagine that you have a flight, again, with 100 seats, on which the first seat might have been sold at a very low fare of 50 euros. In the meantime, you've sold the full capacity and the overbooking. Your bid price curve is now at maybe 500 for the next seat. In today's world, once you get to that overbooking limit, you stop selling. What we are proposing here instead is you should continue selling, even knowing that the next seat will lead to a passenger being displaced. But if once you've reached that complete physical capacity, you can start pushing the price significantly higher in an exponential increase. I call that asymptotic pricing, because it makes the price curve go like this. And the reason why this is
Sorry,
fine
say that one more time. What did you call that?
is asymptotic pricing.
Oh,
An
yeah,
asymptote in
yeah.
mathematics is a
Yeah.
curve that goes to infinity.
It's clever, very good.
You can do that if you have a good process for proposing voluntary offboarding to other passengers. Because if you have a passenger who is willing to pay 1,000 euros for the next seat, you can make an offer to the passenger who paid 50 euros to be moved to another flight. You could offer them 3 times the price they paid to be moved to another flight. For some passengers, this is going to be great. If they are not time sensitive, for them waiting for a few hours or even for a day or two in exchange for getting more than they paid for that flight back overall is a great win. So this is a rare case in economics where not only this is not a zero-sum game between the 3 parties involved, the initial passenger, the airline, and the new passenger, but it is literally a win-win-win for all the parties. The initial passenger, of course, if they accept the offer, they will make some extra money that they hadn't expected. The airline will make more revenue because they are getting an extra passenger on that flight, and the passenger who is paying a much higher fare. And the new passenger is winning because they are getting on the flight that they wanted, restricted to only that time slot. And in today's world, they wouldn't be able to book that flight anymore. So that's one opportunity afforded by this transition to looking at availability of the product, not as a binary available or not available decision, but rather as a question of at what price I'm still willing to make this product available, even knowing that effectively I've sold already more than I can actually supply.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One, I had a lot of experiences like this when I was younger, especially when my brother was in university, flying, short flights back home usually through Alaska or Southwest. And almost every time he flew home, they had that offer for him to anyone willing to go on the next flight because we're overbooked. And he always took it, to get those vouchers. University students could always use the money, but I don't see that. I haven't experienced that or witnessed that much anymore. Do you think that's a positive thing because there's higher accuracy with the sell decision process, or because airlines maybe have abandoned or aren't taking as much risk with the sell decision, and so therefore that
It can
that doesn't come into play, that scenario doesn't come into play as often.
It can be for a number of reasons, and I don't really want to speculate. It is true that in the US, on the US market, this is happening more often. This is used even in today's world, it is done more than in Europe or Asia. However, I think there are some ways in which the process used by American carriers can be improved, because American carriers tend to leave that decision very, very late, or often as late as literally at the airport.
Yeah, you're literally
Yeah, at the
boarding. Is
boarding.
anyone willing to stay overnight for?
What I would regard as a best in class process is not to leave it as late as that, because you can continually reforecast, and in many cases, you can detect that earlier. You can propose to your passengers voluntary offboarding 2 or 3 days before the flight. So you don't have to put them in the inconvenient situation of being at the airport, choosing to go on another flight and then having to go back home. So there are ways to improve that. Why you are experiencing this less now, I'm not sure. I think it's still a practice which is fairly common. Again, there are airlines who are applying this in Europe as well. I think it is still more common in the US. In some cases, it can simply be because the demand on those routes might be lower than it used to be. Certainly, the demand between Europe and the US is softer now than it was up until about a year and a half ago.
We won't get too much into that right now, but it's very right. There's a lot of things that can come into play, even down to the individual airline route, or the individual airline's position, or like you said, the country that they're in, or the route they're flying to, whatever it could be. Okay, that's really good to know. So we just covered a bit about, more of the fare pricing, seat pricing, the tickets, buying your tickets. But pricing doesn't stop there. We've touched on this a little bit already around bundles and how the structure of bundles might work and the transition path for that. But I would like to dig into it a bit more, particularly when bundling is the product side equivalent of the same transformation challenge that Radu just spoke on. So Niels, this is being discussed a lot today, but the transition path is genuinely and generally quite complicated. So, what do you believe is a realistic step by step move towards not only more flexible and intelligent bundling? What could that look like? And also, what are some of the challenges on the product side that could come from this? Either for commercial, it could be, distribution wise. We're all ears. The floor is yours.
Like we already mentioned, bundles today are rather static, and that's because of a numerous of reasons. But let's call these restrictions are beyond the airline's control. No, an airline which transitions to offer and order management systems, luckily, has the time to transition, because at the moment, no airline can transition with a big bang. It will take years before they move from a classic PSS system to an order management system. So with dynamic bundling, well, the dynamic bundling in the airline can actually follow the same slow transition. So the airline has time to go from a static product determination environment to dynamic bundling specifically for every request. But like with any situation, I think it's absolutely crucial to understand what you're doing, to understand which bundles am I creating, to who am I offering. And for this, I think there's three key components we have to take into consideration. It's first data and how we use our data. An airline has an enormous amount of data from several sources, most notably their own sources, their own bookings, their own shopping data, etc., etc. So the airline needs to rationalize the data, store the data, and make the data accessible so the data can be used to understand who their passengers are and what are their and what are the needs are. Then the second, which follows that is, okay, let's try to understand travel purposes. Historically, airlines have talked about leisure and business and pleasure, or whatever those words are. But I am convinced there are much more travel motives and travel segments which have a combination of different factors. So I would say use this data to build a really performant customer segmentation model to understand the travel motive. A customer segmentation model can give you a lot of information on what are the specific needs of travelers, what is their propensity to buy for ancillaries, etc., etc. The third one is you need to do some tests, because only when doing significant tests you can really understand if a bundle or a product scope is working versus not, and how is and if the pricing is right for that bundle or product. So be able to do A/B tests in the market, be able to implement A/B tests in a really fast way is crucial to understand which dynamic bundles you're going to put in the market. So I think these three are basis. When these basics are right, the airline can actually start to create bundles on the fly, as we say. So we go shopping on the airline website and we get a personalized bundle and to see if it works. But from a personal note, I do not think that we will go to 100% bundle on the fly situation, neither when airlines are able to do so in the future. I still think that airlines will have their basic offering, like a light and a standard, and then maybe a third one in that specific cabin, which is personalized for you. Reason for this is that human beings actually do not like too much choice. They also like to have clarity. Or think about it. A little analogy is that you go to a restaurant. If you go to a restaurant where the menu card 50 pages, you go nuts. You do not know what to choose. And two, you also believe that that restaurant offers less quality food because they have to store so much. Whereas you go to a restaurant with 5 dishes, it makes you feel much more at ease. And it's the same for airlines. So I still think that travelers will expect a certain fixed amount of bundles, and then we'll have maybe one or two personalized ones.
And do you believe that there's, or what's your opinion on how that plays out at different touch points as well? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing, Brett, is that a lot of this that you're discussing is during that booking phase, and there's a lot more strategy and optimization around. Well, you don't necessarily need to offer your passengers everything during the booking. Spread it out a bit. Don't overwhelm them. See what's available to them, what they're interested in during the MMB or check-in phase. Do you think that also affects how your 3 points may come into play? Or is that related to data? Could be, depending on what your data says, that's going to affect, your strategy and ability to test.
Of course, it's part of the same. Like your data and your customer segmentation and your understanding of the market should be able to tell you when you should offer what and at which point you get the highest propensity to buy fruit and ancillaries, for example, for a certain customer segment. And one of the things when we talk about next generation revenue management or next generation price optimization solutions is a solution which gets this data, understands this data, understand all of these shifts in the market, and which actually can understand that we offer the right to fly, or the flights were made to be at this price now because we know it's in a certain travel segment which we might not be able to name because it's probably AI which will segment or market, because we know that they will 3 days before departure, the likelihood of them buying baggage at a higher price is 80%. Like that's where we want to go. But of course, we do this in small iterative steps because also we need to be able to understand these small iterative steps from a systems perspective and an outcome perspective. It's really important for airlines, and I think actually for wider industries, that people working there need to be able to understand, do not like black box systems as such. So that's why you will not see a big bang in an airline, but small steps towards dynamic pricing, dynamic bundling, dynamic product determination.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially when you're working with a lot of different systems as well. You kind of need to do that phased approach, not only for time reasons, but to make sure that it's all run smoothly and effectively. And this actually brings up a good point for our listeners today. Highly recommend, if you want to hear more on this topic, and the use of data right now in the industry, highly recommend the prior episode to this about WDS with the 3 heads of data and technology from IATA. They outline this really, really well, that the data's there. Airlines aren't hungry for data, but they're not using it, or they're not using it right, or they don't know what to use or how to use it. So there's a difference between not having the data or not having the tools or the ability to A/B test, and then actually knowing the effective way to use them or segment, and then actually analyze those results. So go
Well,
ahead
I
and
don't
take a
know.
look at that.
I'm not sure I would fully adhere to that view, Clarissa. I'll give you one concrete example of something that airlines struggle with today in revenue management specifically, because today the pricing is done at, like I mentioned earlier, at a bundle level. You are pricing a fare which has 5 to 10 elements usually. Modern airline retailing terminology would say it has 5 to 10 service items within the same offer item. And because we are pricing them as a whole, in today's world, we don't actually know what exact percentage of the total price of the bundle is apportioned to each of those service items within the offer, right? To make this more concrete, we don't know if a passenger is booking a fare of 500 euros for an economy standard fare, which includes right to fly, certain right to change conditions, certain right to cancel conditions, a cabin bag, a hold bag, maybe a certain seat allocation for a standard seat, and so on. Ideally, in order to optimize our pricing more scientifically, we should know how much each of these individual elements represents within the total price of 500 euros. And in today's world, we don't, because we don't calculate the pricing in that way. So this is one example of data which is genuinely not available today. And honestly, every single person I've talked to in the world of revenue management agrees, regardless of what their views might be about unbundling or rebundling or dynamic bundling, everyone agrees that we should have data on how much of the price is apportioned to these different elements. And that's something that most airlines will not be able to collect today. Nobody knows within the total price how much is apportioned to each service.
And when you say how much is allocated, are you talking about the price that the passenger sees, or the profit and revenue that the airline makes, especially if the bundle includes a third party and they have to do, pay out to the individual?
It's the
Interesting.
it's the internal reference price of each item. This would never be disclosed to the customer anyway, right? If you sell a
Yeah.
bundle, you don't tell the customer, out of the price of 500, this is how much you're paying for the right to fly, and this is how much you're paying for the change, and how much you're paying for cancellation conditions. You are just see the total bundle price. But for the airline's internal price optimization science, it is crucial to be able to know that out of this total of 500, we value the right to fly at maybe 300, the right to change at 50, the right to cancel at 100, the seat at 30, and so on and so forth.
Because that could that also affect how they price those items on their own on their own as well? Okay.
But also because it helps you optimize the price in the future. Price optimization relies a lot on historical data, right? It doesn't rely exclusively on historical data, but it relies a lot on historical data. You gradually over time establish the elasticity of a product in a certain market by offering it at different points in time at different prices and seeing how customers react to it. And you cannot do that if you don't know how much the customer has been paying, even without knowing, for that specific element. So if you don't know I think flexibility is the perfect example of that. Many revenue management people swear by the value of flexibility within a bundle. Like the right to change and the right to cancel historically have been two of the most important segmentation products within revenue management, because generally we think that people who are booking with high flexibility products will also have a lower elasticity. They are willing to pay a higher price. They are generally more targeted at business travelers. But the reality is that very few airlines are actually pricing flexibility scientifically. Most airlines in today's world price all the elements within a bundle apart from the right to fly as an increment on top of the right to fly at best. So you have your most basic fare within a cabin, your economy basic or business class light. That's your baseline for pricing. And then all the others are priced as an add-on on top of that. If your business class light or economy basic is, I don't know, 1,000 euros, then the next one, which is maybe standard, will be priced at plus 300. And the most expensive one, which includes flexibility, will be priced at plus 800. And there is a certain degree of research that goes into the pricing of these increments, but it's not at the level of granularity that we would like it to be, and which we would need to have to be able to price specifically each atom. This is basically going back to what I was talking about earlier about atomic pricing.
Yeah.
Pricing, it's a prerequisite to have the data on the price of the atoms.
So far, a lot of what we've been discussing around the dynamic pricing or pricing models and bundling, approaches is the actual approach style. Like once you have the technology, once you have the vendor, you're ready to actually set up those, the models for the modeling. But Niels, from your perspective, what about what becomes before that? So, for example, when an airline is working out which dynamic pricing approach to take or which vendor is the right vendor for them, what do you think are some questions they should genuinely be asking and thinking critically about, as opposed to the ones they tend to default to or that are popular but maybe not as effective?
It actually comes back to my previous answer. Do your homework before making your decision. And I think a shift in anything within an airline, specifically when you talk about commercial systems, should be driven by business needs and by business requirements, not by industry conferences where people talk over and over about modern airline retailing. Yeah, but we don't see where they talk about it, but we don't see real implementation. So first, what are my business needs? What do I want to achieve within my department, within the airline? Is it more revenue? Is it to be ability to have more products, etc., etc., and map these and work cross-departmental, not in silos, to define those business needs within the strategy of the airline. And only when you have those and you identify like, okay, my current systems or my current processes are not sufficient for those needs, the first thing I would do is investigate your current solution setup. Maybe you're not using your solution setup optimally, or you can challenge your current vendor. I mean, you work with suppliers, you pay those suppliers. I'm sure you can ask those suppliers questions, and maybe by relatively simple changes, you can already achieve a few things, or you can take a few steps forward. Now, if your investigation reveals like, no, we need new systems, we need to go on the market to acquire new systems, then do a proper market research, go into an RFP, let many vendors react to it and propose their systems, and then choose the one which is best for your company. Now, it's not because a system because a system on paper is the best and serves all of your needs as an airline that it is the best system. You also have to critically look at processes you have internally and how your organizational setup is, because one of the critical, how you say, risks when you do an implementation, when you make changes, is people and process, not necessarily the IT system itself. So I would also do my homework there and make sure that that everyone is involved and that you look for help with organizations who are specialized in these transition roadmaps. Then when you do have the solutions and the processes to do this dynamic pricing and dynamic product, it's like I said before, small rollouts, tests in the market, understand everything. Don't go blind, don't fly blind into we want to do everything innovative and everything is dynamic. It will probably backfire. Understand, like with my previous question, the basis is understanding, but in this case, driven by the business. And then maybe on a small personal note, as being in this industry, I love the innovation about it. And sometimes we have the feeling that we're not that innovative for some reasons, but I think a lot of innovation is coming. And I think that it's very important for the entire industry that airlines keep on embracing innovation and give small vendors or new entrants the chance to show their innovative product or the new ways of thinking it, which they can implement at the airline. Because for the airline, it might result in that the solution is cheaper and works better. If we continue to if we continue to work just with the known vendors and with a very big known vendor, then we're not going to foster rapid innovation in this industry. So
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. I mean, it's exactly your point. When people might accuse the airline industry for not being as innovative, I would argue we're taking your advice and we are doing the research, and the industry is doing those phases rollouts and testing. But yeah, I mean, again, got to give a shout out to Branchspace Consulting. We are on the smaller side, and that does present a lot of advantages and market edge that isn't necessarily offered by those larger, for lack of better words, legacy vendors or consulting companies. Well, that was quite insightful. Thank you so much, Radu and Niels, for being here today. You guys have such interesting takes coming from different perspectives, but yet covering and really collaborating together. And you can really see how these different processes or structures or approaches are interwoven between, your two specialties. So for anyone who is interested, we are available. You can check out our website, other podcast episodes, or get in contact with Radu directly. Once again, I want to thank you both for coming on the Branchspace Future Picks podcast. I'll let you say your last shout outs and then we'll close it out.
Thank you very much, Clarissa, and thank you for having us.
yep,
My pleasure.
likewise. Thank you. Thank you so much. See you next time.
See you next time on Future Picks.